everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. My name is Rose Wessel. I'm Program Manager for No Frack Gas in Mass, which is a program of Berkshire Environmental Action Team. Berkshire Environmental Action Team protects the environment for wildlife in support of the natural world that sustains us all. And we have three major focus areas: stewardship, education and outreach, and watchdogging. And our No Frack Gas in Mass program falls under that watchdogging category. And also presenting today is Cathy Kristofferson.
Thank you, Rose. Yes, I'm Cathy Kristofferson with the Pipeline Awareness Network for the Northeast, or PLAN. We were a 501c3 formed in 2015 out of half a dozen or so of the pipeline groups in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, fighting the Kinder Morgan NED, the Northeast Energy Direct, and the Connecticut expansion projects. We formed for the legal and regulatory work of opposing the overbuild of gas infrastructure, which in these days of climate chaos now is, of course, all gas expansion projects, and also to champion the clean energy future, which we should all be moving towards. And we like to work with groups like BEAT for the organizing side. Next, please.
And we really thought it was important with the new pipeline proposals that we do an overview of infrastructure and permitting processes so everyone knows what they're looking at.
Yeah, so interstate transmission gas pipelines are the pipes that bring the gas from the shale fields across the United States to their end use or export terminal. It's not the intrastate distribution pipelines of our local gas utilities. Next.
So let's start with the very basics. What is natural gas? Natural gas, it's a gaseous byproduct of oil drilling. Some folks sometimes assume it's related to gasoline. That's actually an oil product. It's what comes into homes via pipelines for cooking and heating, gets used by power stations to generate electricity. It's primarily made of methane, usually around 90% methane. Some of the other byproducts of natural gas are ethane, propane, and butane, also known as natural gas liquids. That's not the same as liquid natural gas, which is gas that's been cooled until it becomes a liquid. There are also some trace elements in natural gas that come from the shale deposits that they're drawing from or from the extraction process. Methane is over 80 times more potent a greenhouse gas than CO2. So when it leaks into the atmosphere, it has a lot more punch than if it's actually burned. It's also naturally colorless and odorless. Folks may be familiar with the smell that they get when they get gas service. You get a little scratch and sniff card. That's actually mercaptan. That's a chemical that's added to the gas so that it can be detected in your home. 67% of all gas in the US is obtained by hydraulic fracturing, otherwise known as fracking. And the process of fracking gas is extremely polluting to water, soil, and air at the extraction site. Shale extraction is how they drill the gas out of the ground. It uses a process called horizontal directional drilling. So they go down first and then they can bend at like a 90-degree angle. And then they break apart the rock to get the gas pockets out of there. A lot of people think that you just put a well down and the gas just bubbles up, but they actually have to fracture the rock to get it out. So the Marcellus Shale is the one that's closest to us, and the Utica Shale is underneath that. That's in New York, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. The Marcellus Shale is about 4,000 to 8,500 feet down, and way down below that, 6,000 to 14,000 feet is the Utica Shale. And the proximity of New England to this large source is one of the reasons why they keep trying to get more gas through here. They keep seeing it as an easy thing that they can tap, but it's much more complicated than that. So we're going to take a look at the infrastructure of the gas transmission lines. So why pipelines? Why does the industry like to use pipelines? It's a safer means of transport for gas, safer than vehicles or trains, but it still has accidents. There were 263 significant incidents in 2024 alone. It only becomes liquid when it's cooled then it's LNG. That's when it goes into storage tanks, transported by ship, through truck. But the process of gasification and degasification has a lot of its own problems. So that's not any better way to transport.
So yeah, the interstate pipelines are the distribution networks of our gas utilities, known as local distribution companies or LDCs, you'll hear them called, like Eversource and Boston Gas of National Grid and Berkshire Gas and that. And the interstate transmission gas pipelines are the pipes that move that gas around the US from those shale plays that Rose was talking about. For us, they bring the gas from states like Pennsylvania or up from the Gulf or down from Canada. Interstate pipelines are very high pressure pipelines crossing state lines to bring, that gas from hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Usually they're very large diameter pipes running at very high pressure. So some of the interstate pipes are smaller laterals off the main transmission, all within one state or across state lines to bring gas to a particular customer, like a gas plant or one of their distribution companies. Next.
So the entire natural gas system is divided into three main sections. There's production, that's where the wells are drilled and where the gas is processed. It's refined before it goes out through the main system. And the transmission system in this chart is on the medium color green. Think of that as the super highway. The gathering lines from the gas wells to the production plant are kind of like your streets in your neighborhood. And the transmission line was like the super highway where large volumes of gas travel to their end use. And then at the end use, there are gate stations and laterals that bring it to distribution companies. Some of those laterals go directly to industrial users. The rest goes to gas companies. So that's like your Eversource, your National Grid, Unitil, Berkshire Gas that are in part of the distribution network. And again, we're looking at the transmission pipeline, which has its own set of infrastructure. Next.
And this is a diagram of the typical gas system highlighting the distribution system taken from an Eversource filing. You can see their system in the middle there outlined in the red dashed area. Before them is the interstate system transmitting the gas from the well to their system. And after their distribution is the customer service lines and meters on the buildings. Next.
And I wanted to include this map. It shows just how many pipelines we have in the US. The blue lines are all interstate pipelines, and the gray ones are those intrastate. Those tend to be gathering lines and smaller laterals that bring gas to the main transmission pipeline systems. And these are the existing pipeline system, gas transmission systems in the Northeast. You'll see there are two blue ones coming in from the west. Those are both Tennessee gas pipelines. One comes through Pennsylvania and up into Connecticut to Massachusetts. The other one comes across upstate New York into Massachusetts. And the other one that we deal with a lot is the Algonquin, unfortunately named Algonquin Pipeline. That's an Enbridge company. Comes up through Connecticut into Rhode Island and Massachusetts. Then there's also the also unfortunately named Iroquois Pipeline, which comes out of Canada down to through New York, part of Connecticut, and then back around to Long Island. There's also Maritimes in Northeast, which goes up towards the Canadian Maritimes. The other two actually bring gas out of Canada. That's the PNGTS and Vermont Gas. The others are all bringing gas up from Marcellus Shale and areas further south.
I think the Iroquois brings gas down too. This is a map of our existing and proposed interstate pipelines in the Northeast. I modified a map that one of the companies was showing a graveyard of pipeline projects, but of course now the New York projects for the Constitution and the Northeast Supply Enhancement, that NESE from Transco down on the bottom, they were revived last year following the federal executive orders trying to make U.S. energy supremacy. The Northeast Energy Direct, the NED up there, and Access Northeast both remain withdrawn for New England expansions. Also in the map, I added in the newly proposed AGT enhancement rare. I'm just going to call the appropriated Algonquin the AGT. Underneath those expansions, you can see all of the interstate pipelines that Rose just mapped out for us. Next.
Okay, so when you're looking at the actual structure of the pipeline, it's really important to make note of the diameter of the pipeline and also something called the MAOP. That stands for maximum allowable operating pressure, and that's the highest pressure at which a pipeline system is allowed to operate. The pipeline companies prefer to have the highest MAOP they possibly can so that they can pack as much gas as possible into a system. It's intended, the intended MAOP determines the strength and the thickness of the steel used in the pipeline walls. Some of that depends on how dense the development is around a pipeline. We have an appendix to these slides that gets into the different classes. So if you're in a rural area, you get a thinner pipe. If you're in a more urban area, you get a thicker pipe that has more strength. MAOP combined with the pipeline's diameter determines the potential impact radius and affected impact radius. So we're going to get more into what those mean in the next few slides. Sometimes pipelines are designed for a higher pressure, but they promise to run at a lower pressure, but then they'll up it after approval. They'll either apply for a waiver to go with a higher pressure, or they'll have another proceeding to up the pressure on a pipeline after approval. That's something to look out for when a pipeline is applying for permits.
Yeah, and this slide shows the various sizes of pipes we've seen installed in our area recently. The AGT West Roxbury lateral up there in the top left corner was about had 16-inch pieces and 24-inch pieces. The two bottom corners both are 42-inch pipelines in Connecticut and New York, and in the middle shows the Tennessee 36-inch pipe added. It's the third pipe in parallel in that existing and expanded easement through our state forest in Sandusfield. And the top right corner, I just put in there, it's not in our area, but it gives you a really good idea of how huge these pipes are, because that's a guy standing there welding the two pieces together.
Yeah,
Next.
a 42-inch pipeline is basically chest height,
Yeah.
Large. Yeah. So this is more detail on the potential impact radius. It's worth noting that the industry itself also refers to this as the incineration zone. So this is the zone around a pipeline at which things are really destroyed if there's ever an explosion. It can be total or severe damage or total damage within that zone in case of an explosion. And it's worth noting that that impact radius is a radius. That means that the zone of, however many feet it extends is on either side of the pipeline. It depends at the pressure on which the pipeline is operating at the time, times the diameter of the pipeline. The affected impact radius is an outer ring outside of that, where damage happens, it's just not as severe. And also that's calculated using the same MAOP and diameter. Less damage is likely. It includes singeing vegetation, maybe melting of, if you have vinyl siding, your vinyl siding might melt, your windows might implode, but it's not a total structural damage like in the PIR. It's also the zone that's most likely to be evacuated during gas leaks or other incidents. And I made a couple of examples comparing different pressures. If you have a 36-inch pipeline at 850 pounds per square inch, the potential impact radius is 724 feet. But if that same pipeline then ups its pressure later on to say, no, we'd like to run at the 1400 feet for which it was designed, or 1400 PSI for which it's designed, that goes up to 929 feet. And these calculations are fairly conservative. Even the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Agency that designed this agrees that it's a fairly conservative calculation. They can be higher depending on a whole host of conditions at the scene. The PIR also helps determine high consequence areas. High consequence areas are zones within 220 yards of a pipeline with high occupancy dwellings or sites where people congregate. So this can be hospitals, daycares, prisons, retirements, assisted living, anything where a lot of people congregate that happen to be in the PIR or the AIR. And I took a couple of examples from the currently proposed intrastate pipeline. That's the Eversource pipeline that they want to put through Longmeadow and Springfield. We mapped out the actual pipeline route and identified the potential impact radius uh, in red, and then the affected radius in yellow. And you can see where it goes by the Basketball Hall of Fame. The whole front of the building is well within the PIR. Also, about half of the Hilton Garden Hotel is within that space. And a little bit further down the pipeline route, you get Long Hill Street Apartments. That's within the PIR. Sumner Place Apartments is within the AIR, so they're likely to sustain damage. Also, Sumner Avenue Elementary School is right in there. So when there's a proposal, it's really handy if you can get a map of where it's going to go and get someone to do some mapping to figure out what's going to be in danger.
And also, Rose, that's Route 91 in there.
Yeah, yeah. It also overlaps Route 91 and that lovely interchange for the
Yeah.
Longmeadow uh, exit. Yeah. So accidents and incidents, as noted, there are several hundred significant incidents every year in the U.S. The average deaths is about 12 per year and 55 injuries per year associated with these. And it can take the form of fires, explosions, or leaks. The most common cause is corrosion, particularly where a pipe has a bend and a weld for that bend, or if there's a juncture that the weld started to corrode. It can be equipment failure. It can also be things like dig safe accidents where somebody struck a pipeline. But what you can really see is where the incineration zone is. Most of them, if you look at them up, you can see picture after picture from different explosions. There's an area that looks red, and that's where everything has just been vaporized by the size of the explosion. And then the outer ring is where the affected impact radius is. So that's where vegetation gets singed and houses may sustain damage, but probably not structural damage. And when determining when there's looping, that's when they lay pipelines down next to each other, parallel to each other. They say that you want to look for the PIR for both pipelines on the outer edge, and that will determine what the actual potential impact radius is. But it's worth noting, for instance, some of the AGT enhancement has a much larger pipeline being laid down next to a smaller pipeline. That larger pipeline's PIR is going to outweigh the smaller PIR of the smaller pipeline. So you need to look at what the actual radius is from the largest pipeline to determine what the zone is.
So that would leave both pipelines within the other's incineration zone, correct?
And how far apart they are, yeah.
Yeah. And this slide is a screen grab from an Enbridge video that helps people understand what pipeline looping actually is. So it's sort of a second pipe running in parallel to the main line. And as Rose said, sometimes the loop is bigger than the main line. But anyway, it sort of connects, it comes out of the main line, runs along parallel, and then connects back in. And it can be like this for miles or for a short distance. But what it does is it provides additional pipe space for expanding the capacity and how much gas is being held or stored nearest to the use. Next.
So pigging facilities, when I first saw this on my first pipeline application that I looked at, I assumed that it was going to be running near a pig farm or something, but no, pig is PIG, is pipeline inspection gauge. These are basically big squeegees that they put into a pipeline. The pigging facilities have launchers and receivers where the pipeline comes out of the ground and they can insert the pig into the pipeline, and it runs through the pipeline to squeeze out any fluids or other contaminants that may have built up in a segment of pipeline. And then when it comes out the other end, it comes out in a receiver. And if you ever see pipes sticking out of the ground like that, that's what this is for. It's a pigging operation. And if you look at the center indicator on this photo, there's a vent valve on these. That's because they need to vent out the gas from the system to be able to put the pig in there and send it along its way or take the pig out on the other end. So this is one of those points in a pipeline where they vent methane without burning it. And remember what we said about it's 80 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. This is one of those sources of pure methane going out of the system.
And I'll just add on that, on the pigging stuff, is that in the recent expansion in Lowell, Mass, was done so that all the pipes were the same size. You know, it was a bigger pipe into a smaller pipe into a smaller pipe, but they made them all the bigger size, some to accommodate pigging, and they were using those pigs for pipe integrity checks. So they'll do it for that along with the cleaning of the fluids and deposits.
Oh yeah, those are referred to as smart pigs. They're the ones with the
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you. Next.
So compressor stations are another main component of a pipeline's transmission system. Compressor stations are large turbines that run on gas. They keep the gas moving along in the pipeline. They also help pressurize the gas to that high pressure at which the pipeline runs. The turbines themselves run on gas so that you get CO2 emissions there too, and combustion emissions. So aside from, having methane leaks, you also have CO2 emissions, which bring particulate matter to the area around these plants. And that's very hazardous for health. It's very small particulates that can get deep into your lungs and even into your bloodstream. So wherever they're burning the gas, like a compressor station, there's that added type of pollution. And they say they should have them every 40 to 100 miles, depending on terrain. One thing of note is the Constitution pipeline proposal only shows it at either end, and it's a 124-mile pipeline, and they have to get over the Catskill Mountains. So it's likely that there's another compressor station necessary, and certainly if they ever wanted to up the pressure on the system, they would need another compressor station. And sometimes a pipeline company will file with the bare minimum of stuff and then file another proceeding to bolster that existing system. So that's a possibility.
And these are a few of the compressor stations that we've seen added and expanded recently around us, starting from the top left and going clockwise. The AGT in Westbrook, Connecticut, and the Weymouth and the Berryville in Rhode Island, and the TGP in Agawam has been added horsepower to repeatedly in the last decade. In the middle there, I put a mainline valve, which allows gas flow to be stopped either for maintenance or in the case of an emergency, right? They can shut the gas off and work on just that segment. But it also allows for those blow-offs that Rosemary was talking about if they need to reduce the pressure. So like most gas infrastructure, they smell of mercaptan from that venting of raw methane with odorant in it. Not all of the interstate pipelines have odorant in them yet. Depends on state law. In Massachusetts, they do have to have them. Next, please. And so the other common infrastructure that you might see around always within chain link fences is the metering and regulating stations. These are to both meter, which is to measure out the gas added in or put into a transmission pipeline. And the regulating half of the station is to lower or raise the pressure of the gas moving from one system into another. In the case of an interstate system bringing gas to an LDC, they are often called gate stations or city gates or pods, points of delivery, with the interstate pipeline company owning the metering side and the LDC owning the regulating side. And we have a great example of that in the Eversource expansion at the Long Meadow Country Club, where the M&R or the pod will be jointly owned by Tennessee Gas Pipeline and Eversource Gas of Massachusetts. Next, please. And these are just a few of the M&Rs, that we've seen activity at recently. That's the AGT West Roxbury on the lateral, and Tennessee Southwick's M&R. Coventry down there in the bottom corner, we just saw the regulator added to their lateral where somehow there was no regulation of the pressure before. And the TGP in the bottom corner, the city gate in East Longmeadow. And in the center is the famous AGT Lincoln metering station with Tennessee Gas. So that's an interstate to an interstate, sitting on a wooden broken pallet right next to Route 2 that you can see up the embankment there. Luckily that, I don't know, luckily is the right word, but it's good that deteriorating situation was upgraded last year and put in housed in a box so that it's not so open to accident. Next.
So pipeline system management, they are largely run remotely. I actually thought I was calling the Tennessee Gas headquarters one time, and I got a lone guy in a station in Georgia, I believe he was, who was monitoring all the gas pipelines, including up into New England. So they're run remotely from wherever their central pipeline management office is. In the case of Columbia Gas, that's the LDC in the Merrimack Valley, that center was actually in Ohio. And they were working on replacing some of those lines at the time in the Merrimack Valley. And the system didn't realize why parts of the system were depressurizing. So that automated system kept repressuring and upping the pressure to try and compensate for a low pressure signal that it was getting. Because it wasn't somebody there on the ground, they couldn't just call somebody and say, hey, what's going on? And that's how Merrimack Valley ended up with, fires and explosions all along that system. Some say they have a field office, but usually that's the field office calls in the pipeline folks from headquarters to come and manage. And the way that they treat emergencies, they can't put out the fires when they start to burn. The gas needs to burn off between valves. So local training for emergency services is mostly secure the area and call the pipeline company. There isn't a lot you can do. Another type of emergency that happens when they're being built, sometimes they use horizontal directional drilling to go under sensitive habitat, like under a river, under wetlands, and sometimes the mud that they use to sort of grease the casing for the well will bubble back out. It's called a frack out, or the company's favorite phrase is inadvertent return. Basically, it's filling the entire waterway with bentonite clay and whatever chemicals they're using to grease that horizontal directional drilling. Enbridge has a pretty high rate of them. They had some under the Sakonnet River under Narragansett Bay when they were just replacing that pipeline underneath there.
As did Tennessee Gas when they were drilling underneath in Agawam.
Yeah.
So now we're going to review some of the ways that the pipeline companies are expanding their transmission systems. Next. So they can expand their system while they're doing maintenance, like we saw in the Sakonnet River project, which I guess we're going to keep bringing up, but they were fixing some leaks in an 8-inch pipe, and they did that by replacing it with a new higher pressure 16-inch pipe. Or they can expand by adding on infrastructure such as the looping that we saw, lift and lay, or take up and relay, however they want to call it, which is taking up a small line and putting down a big line to replace it, or by increasing horsepower for compression, like the IRQ, the Iroquois, had a whole project called expansion by compression, where they went through their whole line and increased the horsepower in every compressor station. And the Tennessee as I mentioned, keeps expanding in Agawam, or expanding with new pipeline segments like the Algonquin had proposed in the Access Northeast project, where they had 2 new big long line segments to directly connect to a new offtake or a place that they really needed gas without it working its way through the system. And Tennessee adds looping and compression in the Connecticut expansion in both Massachusetts and Connecticut. And AGT, as we all know, famously added the new compressor in Weymouth at the Atlantic Bridge project for an existing line that was there and running. Or they can add a whole new pipeline system like the NED or the Constitution or the NESI that we mentioned in New York. Next. And in fact, that's exactly what we see is being done in the AGT enhancement or RARE project. So they are doing all of the above. They're doing some lift and lay. They're calling it take up and relay. It's the same sort of thing. Looping and increased horsepower. Next. Now we're going to review the federal permitting for pipelines at FERC. Next, please. So there are kind of 2 buckets, I guess I would call it, of federal permits for pipeline projects that come out of FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. One is a blanket certificate for small projects that are not designed specifically for capacity increase, although they are allowed to incidentally increase capacity. But they're supposed to be more for maintenance and other certain types of activities. The other projects are the certificates of public convenience and necessity for new or specifically capacity increase expansion, which, like that AGT enhancement, is. Blanket petitions get decided almost either right away or within a few months. The full certificate process can take a couple to a few years, depending on its complexity. And I'll just pause kind of and explain here the NEPA. NEPA defines the environmental review of these projects, sort of all of these projects. An EA, or an environmental assessment, is really a concise review document taking into account the purpose and the proposed need of this proposal, any alternatives that could be done instead, and a very brief review of the impacted environment. And an EIS, or an environmental impact statement, is a much more comprehensive review requiring everything that was in an EA, and also a much more comprehensive discussion of reasonable alternatives, and a supposedly hard look at the cumulative impact of the proposal, along with all of the existing and reasonably foreseeable future development within the project area, so that there's not like a constant construction zone. That includes a draft and then a final version. Some of us in Massachusetts are familiar with EIRs, so an environmental impact report, the same thing with a different name. A lot of this is the same in the state level. In Mass, like I said, they're called EIRs, but that's sort of that. The blanket certification applications are always just given an environmental assessment, and for full certificate, FERC decides which is appropriate. And in the blanket, you can see the 2 piles are automatic if the project is estimated to cost less than $14.5 million. They just have to notify the abutters before they start construction. If it's more than the 14.5, but it's less than 61,650,000, they have to file what's known as a prior notice with FERC. So giving FERC prior notice to their construction. There's a 60 to 90 day period of comments, protests, and intervention. And as long as any protests are resolved, the certificate is issued. In the certificate of public necessity and convenience, the large projects that are meant for capacity increase, they have an optional pre-file process. They always conduct some scoping of the impacts of the project. They file a certificate application with FERC, and FERC notices it when it's complete. That would give you 21 days for intervention, comments, and protest. and they would go through the environmental review. There's more opportunities for comments and leading down to a certificate issued. Yes, so next, please. So this is the schematic from FERC of the certificate application process. You can see the areas of public input in the light green background boxes, starting over there at the top left of the process. The company files their petition, the public can start commenting right away. Then FERC officially notices the submission and starts some deadlines, clocks going. They do their scoping process, which is working with all of the stakeholders to scope out the impacts, decide whether an EA or an EIS is required. They go through these processes. We come back up to this on the right side of the screen, provide input, finish those, and approve or deny the project. Down at the bottom, anyone that is unhappy with the decision can request a rehearing process and eventually perhaps appeal it in appeals court down in Washington, D.C., where FERC is. I would note that that is pretty expensive, requires counsel in DC. And meanwhile, the pipeline companies will often start the construction process, as we saw in the Constitution project, where they cleared all the trees already. A decade later, they're still fighting whether they want to do the project or not. And I would also note that the FERC application is often approved before any of the other permitting is finished. They should need to wait before construction, but that isn't necessarily always the case. Next, please. The pipeline companies can also choose to go through what FERC calls a pre-filing process, which sort of formalizes a lot of the decision-making of what and where the project will be in more of a public setting, so that it involves FERC and all the stakeholders and the general public. Other stakeholders might be other federal or state agencies. And the pre-filing is done in a PF docket. That scoping proceeds along similar to what the previous was. And it comes down to where they file the docket in a CP docket. Next, please. And then it proceeds very similarly to what we just saw in the non-pre-filing process and completes the environmental review with either an EA or an EIS, a draft and a final, and then gets to issuing the certificate. Next. This is a little flow chart I made to show the flow of the blanket certificate process. So if it's less than 14.5 million, you kind of don't skip, go get your $200 and the blanket certificate is issued. If it is under 16 and sort of a $500,000, then it requires that prior notice I said. Once that's filed and noticed, there's a 60-day comment period. If a protest is filed that isn't deemed frivolous, such as an abutter who just has an issue with where the pipeline is being placed, then they have 30 days to resolve that. If it's resolved, then the certificate is issued. If that, it moves to a case-specific process, which is actually what happened in the Secaunet project. But then once it got into that case-specific authorization project down there in Rhode Island, they deemed the protest frivolous, and they were issued their blanket certificate and the construction began. In some case, which I've never seen, they would, if they cannot resolve the protest, they would have to go over to a full certificate proceeding. Next. And this slide shows most of the other federal permits that can be required depending on the location and the impacts of the project, right? So for example, you wouldn't involve coastal zone permitting if you aren't near the coast, but usually you need clean air permits, clean water. There's often eminent domain takings, and you should always be looking at local, state, and indigenous historic preservation. Additionally, there could be state versions of these permits that they will need to get. Like in Massachusetts, we have a MEPA process, which is similar to their NEPA process. And state siting boards might want to do some advisory review along with the state required permits. I would note that the federal government is trying to squash a lot of these in their efforts to rush through the fossil projects and our energy supremacy situation, but I think we'll see how far they get with that in this Constitution proceeding, because so far New York does seem to be sticking to their denial of the 401 water quality, denied way back in that 2013 proceeding, even though unfortunately New York folded on that exact permit in the Nessie revival. So we'll see what the federal government can do in their pursuit of all things fossil.
It
Next,
is
please.
worth it is worth noting that Constitution filed for a waiver for the 401 water quality certificate in in their new proceedings. So we'll see whether or not they get granted that wish.
Well, right, and after they filed it again new in 2025 and withdrew it because it was going to be denied again. And it's sort of a game, and that's why they're trying to just make them unnecessary. So there's just 3 slides here with examples of each kind of certificate. So this is a blanket certificate. This is the infamous Sakonnet River project that we've mentioned a couple times now, that went under the Sakonnet River and then under that nice swamp there to a meter station. Next, please. And this is the AGT expansion, also known as RARE, reliable, affordable, resilient enhancement. You can see the 3 kinds of expansion that they'll have there. It is a capacity expansion, so they should need to have a certificate proceeding. We don't know if they will go through a pre-file because they have not filed with FERC yet. They did go with a pre-file down at the Cape Cod project that's being proposed at the moment at FERC, and under the proceeding, they have done the pre-file and gone on to the CP filing. So we'll see what they want to do. This one is much smaller, the AGT enhancement. Next,
And
please.
if you want to go to the nofracgasandmass.com events page, there are a bunch of info sessions for the AGT expansion or enhancement that are
Enhancement.
coming.
Yeah. And this just shows the Constitution pipeline, because this is a big greenfield pipeline. So they call it greenfield when there's, yeah, I guess no brownfield yet, because they haven't come through and taken all the vegetation away. So it starts down there, and you can see in the very fracking area of Pennsylvania, and goes on up to the Wright Hub, which most of us from the Kinder Morgan Ned days knew that was where the Ned pipeline was going to start. But it's also the interconnect of the Constitution pipeline, the Iroquois pipeline, and the Tennessee gas pipelines. So we'll have to see if they build that, and they build what they're calling the Wright Interconnect Project, what will be revived to bring gas to New England. Will it be the Tennessee gas pipeline NED or the AGT Access Northeast, or what they'll do? Because, as we hear, our pipelines are constrained, so they don't have room for more gas. So building that Constitution to bring gas to New England will require additional interstate expansion. Next.
So next, we're going to be talking a little bit about working with FERC. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission regulates interstate gas and oil transmission pipelines. They also regulate interstate electric transmission. It's made up of 5 commissioners, and the 5-year terms are staggered so that they're replaced on sort of a rolling basis. They're nominated by the president, and they need to be approved by Congress. And there needs to be a 3-2 party split. So at any time, there could be 3 Republicans or 2 Democrats, or 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans. It's to try and balance out the political leanings. One of the things that's most notable is it's usually industry veterans. It's people that either worked in the gas industry or somewhere in the regulatory agencies, and they kind of pop in and out of those roles between FERC and working with industry or with regulation. FERC's budget comes from annual charges, and fees that are from filing from the natural gas companies that are applying for permits. So they're funded by people who are looking for projects, which is a notable, it seems like a bit of a conflict of interest.
Yeah,
Um,
to say the least.
the slogan among some is that they're the rubber stamp agency for that reason. Next slide, please. The FERC website recently got an overhaul, at least on the front page. So if you go to ferc.gov, it looks like a fancy modern website. You can see on the side there's links to the e-library where you can look up any of the pipeline proposals that have been made or being made. You can search all the way back in time to pipelines that have already happened if you needed to look for examples. Each project is filed with FERC and it gets a docket number. And Cathy mentioned a little bit, if it's a certificate proceeding, it's a CP. If it's a pre-file, it's a PF. So Constitution, they're not going through a pre-filing process. So their main docket number is CP 13499-006. And you can go onto the FERC website and plug that number in there and see all of the dockets that have, or all of the documents that have been filed on that docket. They also have a new Office of Public Participation that is geared to helping people. So if you ever have trouble navigating the website, finding information, they are there to help you find what you're looking for. They won't give you a lot of insight on the pipelines, though, but they do help with technically navigating their website. Next slide, please. This is where you actually end up when you go to file. So it goes from that nice, bright, shiny new website to basically back to the 1990s. And that is ferconline.ferc.gov. So when you're back there, it gets a little clunky. You need to register to be able to file. And there are a lot more steps when you're filing than you think you would need. You select something and then you have to say, yes, I really meant to select that and submit that. There are a lot of extra steps in doing this. So just be forewarned, it gets clunky when you actually get to the filing. But from here, you can register so that you can file. You can also subscribe to a docket so that as soon as anybody files anything on the docket, you get an email with a notification of it and a link to that new document. That can be very handy if you're really watching a proceeding.
Some of that clunkiness, Rose, I think, is because they're trying to deal with bots and automated filing in the 1970s website, as you say, that's not prepared for that. So they make you register to do the simplest thing, e-comment, which defeats the purpose of a simple comment.
Yeah. So most interactions will with FERC will be under that e-filing, and comments are probably the easiest way to go. That can be, you can either draft a document and upload it in e-filing, or you can do the online e-comment. And that makes you register. They send you an email that says, here's your link so you can submit your e-comment, but then it's easy. Then you just type in what you want into that web form. You can comment as many times as you like. Your comments should be meaningful, though. Just because you can file every day with the same complaint, it's not a great idea to do that. But it's handy if you file a bunch of comments and then you suddenly realize, oh, I forgot to talk about, the economic impacts of a pipeline. You can go back and file those new comments as things occur to you. Another way to file is a protest. This becomes really crucial for things like blanket certificates, where there need to be comments filed in the form of protests in order to extend consideration before a certificate is granted. And those have very specific arguments that they're looking for. They want to know what standing you may have, or they want really specific arguments about why this pipeline is not a good idea and why you're against it. And it also has certain wording and certain form that you should follow. And we have examples of that on our website. You can also include a request for FERC, to demand more information from an applicant. That's another good way of protesting. And it can also contain your motion to intervene. Motion to intervene can also be filed separately. Um, Filing a motion to intervene allows full party status and official rights beyond public comment. You can file briefs, you can appear at hearings, you can be heard by courts if there's an appeal. As Cathy mentioned, that can be an expensive process. It's good to get a lawyer who's well versed in FERC affairs when you do that. But filing a motion to intervene gives you the right to do that in the future. And it's a good thing to reserve just in case you decide you want it later on. If you file in time, your motion to intervene is always granted. You can also file after the deadline, and they can contest that if they want to. But generally, if you file in time, you will be given intervener status.
Right, and even if your group isn't going to be particularly able to fund and pay for expert witnesses or whatever, if you had motion to intervene, you would be able to join a group
Yep.
that may have the funding and the legal reserve money reserved to appeal a decision. So
Yeah.
you think it doesn't cost anything and it's easy, so it's advised to do it if you think you want to be a full party in any of the proceedings.
And that's why it's good to get your arguments against a project on file as well.
Yep.
Beat had the opportunity to do that with the Tennessee Gas compressor station in Agawam. We made the comment that FERC failed to look at downstream emissions, basically the end use pollution that came from that gas. And Food and Water Watch had legal counsel, and they said, "Would you like to file an appeal?" And we said, "Sure, we'll do that." And we won that appeal in court. And for years afterward, FERC kept saying, "We don't want to get sued again. What about downstream emissions?" So it can have an impact, and it's good to get your filings on record and file that motion to intervene so that if the opportunity arises, you can take advantage of it. Next slide, please. So we could do a whole other webinar on all of the steps it takes to do all this stuff at FERC. Fortunately, we have done that in the past, and we've updated all of those slides, and we have them available on the nofracgasandmass.com site. It's also at the tiny URL, tinyurl.com/howtoferc, and it has step-by-step instructions with screen caps so that you can see what it looks like on that interface. So when something weird comes up, you can check and say, is this right? Or have I gone down the wrong side? So that's a good thing to make note of and keep handy if you're filing against one of these pipelines. This is our contact information, and we'll move into Q&A. Let's see, who has some questions here?
Hi, Rosemary. Thank you so much for doing this. And excuse my ignorance here. I met or heard of you like 10 years ago when I, from New Hampshire, was fighting the Ned pipeline. And some of the things you have said tonight have made me sit up and take notice because I've been so busy paying attention to other things like a potential ice facility in my town. But tonight, so do you think there's a real possibility that the Ned pipeline is going to come back? Because if the Constitution comes back, the Constitution needs to hook up to something or it's just going to spill
Yeah.
stuff in the middle of the state.
That is one of the things that made us nervous when we heard Constitution coming back. Given the way that they've been talking at the FERC meetings ever since, it doesn't seem likely that they would propose a new Greenfields pipeline through New England. They keep
Okay.
saying we'll never get another pipeline through, but then again, they're trying different ways of getting pipelines approved that were denied before. So you can
Mhm.
never say for sure. I think it's more likely that it would take the form of expansions to the existing systems. So stuff that's happening with the AGT system now, they might do something like that with Tennessee Gas as well. Um, you never know, though. We're living in strange times.
And I think it depends a little bit, if I can jump in, what the use of the gas is. Remember the Ned project was had shippers, as they're called, the customers for the gas distribution for space heating, right? the gas that way. The AGT Access Northeast, which was equally a $3 billion proposal back in 2014-15. That one was targeting the electric generation, gas for generating electricity. And that one was more of an expansion with a lot of lift and lay and a lot of looping and more compression, etc. So I think we would need to see what they want to use that gas for. It's more likely electric generation, especially if it's to power the data centers and whatnot that they want to bring this to us.
Okay.
As Rose said, we have to wait and see.
I see a question in the chat from someone who asks, is there any organization like BEAT in Maine where I now live? To which I have to say, no one's like BEAT, but I'll let you, Rose and Cathy, answer if you have any colleagues with whom you work in Maine.
I've only managed to make contact with a few folks in Maine because there isn't a lot of expansion in Maine. There is the Maritimes and Northeast, the Portland natural gas that comes down. But there's, as said, there's certainly no organization similar to BEAT out there. We do know other climate activists for other issues, like Seabrook. So I don't know exactly where you are in Maine, Ward. That's a very large state. But you could send us an email and we can maybe find the right people to connect you with.
Yeah, most of my contact with Maine has been general environmental organizations, not necessarily infrastructure focused ones, but I'm sure we could find someone.
I see another question in the chat asking, what is the status of the Brookfield compressor station? Are things currently on hold?
Well, I think Martha is here. I would recommend Martha.
Just put the response in the chat. Definitely not on hold. They were their Save the Sound did in fact take Deep to court for not allowing the adjudicatory hearing, not considering it, and but in no way do we think that will hold up the final permit that Deep is going to issue for the Brookfield compressor station. And by you guys, you guys, that was a photo of the Brookfield, Connecticut compressor station you had earlier. So not on hold, but probably we won't hear more till March, which is both when the judge will probably release the decision and when Deep will issue the final permit.
We have another question. What requirements are there in relation to the location or concrete efforts for FERC to accept that you are a legitimate intervener?
They generally accept anyone who files in time as an intervener. That being said, one of the arguments they made in the court case that we brought up to appeal FERC's decision on the Agawam compressor station was that as a Berkshire organization, we didn't have any real standing for something down in the Pioneer Valley. One of the arguments that was made was, well, if one of the folks from BEAT regularly went to Six Flags, then maybe they would have some standing because that's close to the compressor station. But on the other side, that didn't stop us from winning that suit. So I think there's a pretty broad range. It's not as heavy as, for instance, say, some of the state proceedings want you to have real, concrete, this is my child, that's going to be impacted when they go to school. Of course, that's always going to be more compelling. If it's going to be near your house, you have a bit more standing to make compromises with the placement of the pipeline and things like that.
Right, but the in time filing a dockless motion to intervene, you don't need any serious credentials to qualify for that. I think you're in your appeal that was more looking into why you would have any standing. but the normal proceedings, the blanket certificate or a certificate of public necessity and convenience, most anybody can qualify.
We have
And
another.
I see one is in Brunswick, so I'll reach out to some folks I know in Maine and see what's going there.
Thanks, Kathy. Another question is, are the costs of transporting gas to export markets borne by U.S. customers?
I wouldn't know necessarily the costs of transporting the gas, but the fact that they are transporting the gas for export raises the domestic cost of gas because they're getting a lot more money for it, transporting it as LNG. So why sell it for $2 here when they can sell it for $6 there? It just makes it more scarce here because they're more interested in shipping it as LNG to Europe.
Yeah, so it secondarily kind of drives up the cost. It has to compete with much more lucrative markets overseas.
Can you give a recap of the Ned pipeline court case where the state of Mass challenged the plan to pass through Spectacle Pond? Were those trees cleared before the pipeline was canceled?
Okay, so that was not the Ned project. That was the Connecticut expansion project. It's Kinder Morgan either way. So the Attorney General's office challenged the eminent domain taking of the Article 97, the conserved land in the state forest. Those trees were not cleared before the pipeline was canceled because that pipeline went through there. Once the court decided that they could take conservation land to expand that's in the pipeline picture slide way back at the beginning, that big gash through the state forest, they did install those pipes.
One case where trees were cleared and then a pipeline was canceled. That was the previous iteration of Constitution pipeline. Constitution was first filed in 2013, and it got all of its permits except for the New York 401 water quality certificate. When they got the Pennsylvania 401 water quality certificate, they were so sure that they were going to get all their permits that they cleared all the trees in Pennsylvania. And then they ended up getting hung up on that last permit, so that pipeline didn't happen. So that's a case where the trees were cleared and then a pipeline was canceled.
So they weren't required to replant those trees, I take it.
There
No.
were probably court cases after the fact. I noticed that the folks who ran a maple farm and had all of their maple grove wiped out, this time around when Constitution filed, I noticed it was their legal counsel that was filing for them when they filed comments. So hopefully something was settled after the fact. I know
They did replant Rose. That's what it will be really horrible if that pipeline comes back.
Yeah.
Since the sugar bush takes decades.
Yeah, takes a long time to resettle. So if they were getting anything, they were just barely getting anything, and now it's being reproposed. There was a pipeline further down the Atlantic seaboard area where they were ordered to replant trees in the temporary work zone. They weren't going to do that, and they planted trees in the temporary work zone. The agreement was that they would be 12-inch trees. And folks were thinking, oh, 12-inch trees, that's nice and stocky trees. They were 12-inch high, otherwise known as deer salad. So when the deer ate all of the trees, they were like, no, we planted the trees. We can't help what happened after the fact. So it depends what kind of agreements you get. Yeah, John asked, can you speak to the significance of the Mass Court case challenging the taking of conservation land, which was decided in favor of the Natural Gas Act?
Yeah, the significance is eminent domain wins everything. Federal eminent domain. They can take any land they want, regardless of its perpetual state of preservation.
Everyone have a great night. Thanks for joining us. These slides will be made available on nofracgasinmass.com, and anyone who registered will also get an email with a recording.